So hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Disrupting Misconceptions and Forging Pathways for Students with Developmental Disabilities. We are Erica Cedillo and Leighton Schneller, your hosts for today.
We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge and respect all of the places that you're coming from, with gratitude for the multiple ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories from which we are all joining today. I join you from the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan peoples.
And I am joining you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations in what is now called Vancouver. So a couple of kind of housekeeping announcements on how our session will go today. We're going to do a brief introduction to the project and how these 4 films have come to life. We're going to do a bit of the overview of how we developed them. We're going to watch our 3rd film in the series, and we're going to hear from our fabulous panelists that are with us today, and we'll have some time for questions and answers. We want to let you know that there is closed captioning available for this session, so you need to click on the bottom that it's in the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You will see a CC logo. If you click on there, you can have access to the captioning. This webinar is being recorded for all of you. If you have friends who were not able to make it, or you know people who would like to watch it, it's going to be available on both websites, Inclusion BC and the CIIC's website. And if you have any technical difficulties or needs, please contact Leah through the chat box. And for all your questions and answers, we ask you if you can please use the logo as well in the toolbox at the bottom. It's the Q&A button, and here you will be sending your questions on this side to the panelists. It's in this other side of the screen where we're at for now. So Leighton and I will be moderating the panel using your questions. So as things go along, please feel free to post them over there. So this film series that we're presenting to you today is the result of a strong collaboration by Inclusion BC and the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship. So I would like to invite now Dr. Rachelle Hall, co-director of the Institute, who will give us a couple of words about our partnership. Rachelle?
Hi, everybody. Welcome today. I'm so excited for this day. We've been looking forward to it for a long time. Just a little bit about the CIIC, the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship. The Institute was the first university-based research center in Canada dedicated to promoting the full inclusion and citizenship, the rights of people with developmental disabilities and their families in Canada. We owe our legacy to amazing community partners such as Inclusion BC, who's been central to our work dating back even prior to the establishment of the Institute at UBC in 2009. No wonder a natural partnership such as this could provide these incredible videos. It's not by accident that our funders are committed to supporting authentic and meaningful collaborations. We'd like to thank the UBC Community Engagement Fund, as well as the Government of Canada's Social Development Partnership Program. And a special thank you to all who made these videos possible, especially Inclusion BC for being such an amazing partner. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachelle. It's been quite a great privilege to do this work together. And we're going to share with you right now, Leighton and I, the evolution and the progress of this project, how it came to life to develop these 4 films in a particularly strange year as has been 2020. And now that we're able to present them to you today. So the origin of the project, its genesis, is that students with developmental disabilities have faced discrimination and stigma in schools for far too long. Extensive media attention has been given to the behavior of the students with developmental disabilities that is considered unsafe. And we have heard from their families that they are being excluded from classrooms and ostracized in their own communities. So organizations from the United Nations to local parent advocacy groups locally and nationally are calling for action to recognize students with developmental disabilities as full citizens and with the right to education and equitable access to it. So in light of this narrative, Inclusion BC and the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship partnered to create 4 short films that would help us to raise awareness about the exclusion of students with developmental disabilities, but most importantly, that they would offer key information and possible pathways to success for students, their families, their schools, and their communities.
Thanks, Erica. We're right on time. How did that happen? You must have a timer on. So I'm going to talk briefly about just the process that we went through. It's almost like a timeline. Maybe you can picture it in your heads. So we began with focus groups. So we had self-advocates, that's adults with developmental disabilities, their family members, experts, researchers, representatives from community organizations, educators came together to brainstorm around what could be the content of each of these films. And more importantly, what questions would we ask folks in the films to develop something that included diverse voices and, most importantly, centered the perspectives of families and self-advocates around these topics. So after our focus groups, then we went and filmed around the province. And as Erica said, it was a tricky year to do this because we had to do this during COVID. But most of our filming happened in June and then in my house in September and then over the summer. So that was the best time that we could. And then we had 40 hours of interviews to then draw from these incredible quotes and voices in terms of this work. We worked with One Island Media, who were wonderfully understanding and deeply engaged with us in a way that represented and welcomed the voices of our participants, and particularly our self-advocates, recognizing that they have something to say and they're often not heard. Then we went into the editing process and tried to cull, and we just want to thank Sue Sterling Burr, Nadia Galvin Hernandez, and Jennifer Christensen Barker, PhD students at UBC, who helped with the editing, and this resulted in shorter and shorter films that could be accessible and gentle provocations in terms of helping us think about what we're doing and growing our practice together as a community.
So what we have as a result is a collection, as Leighton, and I love these words that Leighton has put in our conversations. It's a collection of resources that are both informative and gently provocative to inspire some action.
So there are 4 films in this series. The first, which was released 2 weeks ago at the beginning of February is Inclusive Education Month. And so the first one's called Exercising Self-Determination in Our Schools. We really encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to take a look at that film first, because it really recognizes how self-determination is at the core of the disabilities movement, and recognizing that the right to have your own voice and to be able to participate and direct not just your education but your life is really important. So check that one out. Our second film is called, it was just released last week, it was called Getting Ready to Work in Schools. And that's around the notion that employment and learning about employment needs to happen while we're in school, and that everyone needs to develop an identity and an interest and be recognized to be able to contribute through employment in society. Today's film, which is the one that got us all started in this conversation, is called Reframing Challenging Behavior in Our Schools. And it really helps us step back and think about, as we'll see when we watch it, how we can think differently about behavior and move forward together. And then at the end of this week, indigeneity and disability in our schools will hopefully disrupt our understandings around disability. Most importantly, offer us an inclusive perspective from our Indigenous communities around disability. And now we're going to watch film number 3, Reframing Challenging Behavior in Our Schools.
This calls almost for a drum roll, Leighton. So Leah, please to sharing the film.
Get out your popcorn, folks. Delayed gratification.
Sorry, one second.
Behavior-based communication is a key concept, I think, in inclusion. It's exciting for me because we actually know this.
It's a way for students to tell us that something is happening, that something's not working, that something isn't right? And so, you know, when you get to the point of challenging behavior, it's kind of like the last straw, like someone listened to me.
Some of the words used to describe my behavior has always been disruptive and careless.
Non-teachable, problem child. It made me feel like I was not teachable, like I was a disruption, like I was an annoyance, like I shouldn't be there.
It made it hard to actually find your own identity other than just what somebody else calls you.
When our story about ourselves in relation to our greater context of school is that of a lack of success, then my story or my legacy associated with school is that I can't do it.
You know, as adults, you know, when we think about our situations, we would never want to enter into a new situation where people were focused on the things that we can't do or couldn't do. We want to start with what we do well, and every child has something that they do well.
If we want to think about challenging behavior, we need to think beyond the actions that we observe, because the reality is that behaviors are symptomatic of something else.
Instead of thinking this child's giving me a hard time, we think this child's having a hard time. How can I support them? And we wonder, then we start asking questions because we're curious. We say, what's getting in their way?
I try to find out if they've eaten today, if they need a drink or they need a break. And then I usually try to get them settled down talking about what they like to do.
Your focus needs to be settling things down and coming back to a level where they can engage and then connect and talk about how maybe next time what could be different, and acknowledging that what could be different isn't just in them.
We look at, well, what's the context, what's the community, what's the classroom, the peers, the teacher, the instruction, the time of day. How do we adjust the soil so that the flowers can bloom or the student can be successful?
In order to allow children to be included in every activity in the classroom, we need a lot more education for our teachers.
When kids, their world becomes more chaotic, the adults in their world can co-regulate and lend their calm. But if our educators are burnt out and feeling unsupported themselves, they don't have that much calm to lend.
How do we use resources that include people, time, and funding to support a community, which includes a teacher, but part of that has to be collaboration?
The way we shift the culture of seeing the student as a problem is by being curious.
Having humility and asking questions and knowing that you might get something wrong, but that's okay.
We want to be able to see the child for who they are, what they bring to a situation, what their strengths are.
To actually listen to them, to what they might want to do, or a full group discussion on what they're going to do instead of it just being one way or the highway.
We understand and we know that the kind of supports that benefit one student benefit many students.
If you can get other kids to help that child and that child to help other kids, that's what makes it inclusive.
How we engage with kids, the language that we use, how we empower them to have control over their own behavior and learning and identity development is central to all that we do.
Every day when I go to work, I go there with a mindful thinking that someone else is trusting me, their story. So at the end of the day, I ask myself if I listen to the story with care and respect, or if I could change something.
Wow. I gotta give everyone a couple of seconds to let that sink in. It's very exciting to see them and the message that comes out of them. So now it's actually the time to turn our mics to our wonderful panelists. You have seen them all in this film. They are here to share with us their thoughts on the importance of reframing our approaches to challenging behaviors to create a more compassionate, responsive, and supportive environment for a whole learning community. So I'm gonna just get started introducing our panelists. And our first one today is Tracy Humphreys. Tracy is a parent of 3 children with disabilities. She is the chair of BC Ed Access Society, a grassroots organization advocating for the equitable access to education for children with disabilities and diverse learning needs. So Tracy, we'll pass it on to you now.
Thank you, Erica. First, I wanted to thank you and everyone so much for inviting me to take part on the panel today, and also in the focus group for the film. It was such a good experience to talk about all of this with everyone sort of in depth for a change. And I just want to say I'm joining from the stolen lands of Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And I know you had a couple questions, and I don't know if you want to ask them, or I should just lead into talking about them.
I'll start leading that. Sorry for that. So what are the family's experiences in all this, Tracy? And I think that is a really strong piece that we would like you to invite you to share with us today.
Yeah, and so family experiences, challenging behavior is one of the top reasons that children and youth with disabilities are excluded from school. And exclusion is a very big topic of conversation among our parent community. And some children are fully excluded. Many are told they can only attend partial days or only a few days a week. And what it comes down to, you know, that I've learned from families and from my own children and from myself as well, is that student anxiety rises when supports are not put in place. And with the right supports and some other things, students generally progress and learn. And without those supports, there's growing distrust, there's broken focus, there are health and mental health challenges, and comorbid diagnoses can become aggravated. Students become less able to self-regulate. So I really wanted to answer this. I really wanted to share a parent's success story in their own words. So I'm just gonna have a sip of water and I'll jump in. So our son was only allowed to attend 1 hour a day for 3 months because he was unpredictable and aggressive. He has a complex set of diagnoses, and he struggled with being disruptive in class, making noises, lashing out physically when he was stressed out. After a long period of advocacy and escalating concerns to the principal, the school district, and finally the Board of Education, at that level, we got a letter laying out what the school district would do, the date they wanted our son to return to school full time. This letter exceeded our expectations with a sooner return date and more supports than we asked for. And we're now 23 days in. The school implemented the suggestions and finally listened to us. We'd been telling the school that our son was stressed and the behaviors were reactions to that stress, but they had only been focusing on the behaviors, not the triggers. And now they've been focusing on the triggers. They now include him in all activities instead of limiting his inclusion. And in 23 days, we've not had a single negative email or phone call. The emails and feedback are getting better and better. He's changed so much that we've even noticed it at home. He now feels accepted and wanted at school. And this one change, just in how they interact with him, has brought out the real person inside.
That is so beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, you know, and it's just good to hear the success. And the results, Erica, were not surprising to the parent, right? They already knew that with the right supports, their child would thrive. And then the school was surprised, though, because the results were not only great for that student, but for the staff and other students as well, because the student was happier. So crisis management wasn't a big thing, but also because some of these techniques have been used with other students to great success. So, you know, that's, you know, parents are experiencing difficult things for their kids, but there's also success happening out there.
And it's wonderful to hear those successful stories, and hopefully they will replicate more and more. So this next thing I would like to ask you, Tracy, what actions or hopes does this film inspire for you, or you're hoping to provoke that change?
Yeah, and that's, you know, the major reason that I started BC Ed Access 7 years ago now was because as a disabled parent of 3 disabled children, I felt totally alone and lost in terms of what to do for my kids, and the barriers that were happening for them at school that at that time I didn't even recognize as barriers. Now we have a community of nearly 3,500 families and you know, connections to all kinds of other great organizations like the ones that put together this film series. So I feel a lot more supported, obviously. But what really inspired me in watching the film is the potential in collective action. There are many different perspectives represented in the film, and we all have the same goal. And I think that harnessing this is a great way to start connecting people and organizations and even government ministries that typically, you know, we're all working separately on these things. And I have seen the coming together, you know, in the last couple of years. And I think, you know, that as I shared, there's lots of examples of successful practice in schools, and we just need to shift some perspectives and support others to be successful as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracy. And is there, and if you still have a couple of seconds left, if there's one more idea that you would like to share?
No, I think I covered it. I'll let some of the
come
people
back
have
to
a little
you.
more time. Thanks, Erica.
We'll come back to you. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks, Tracy. I'd like to introduce our second panelist, Shelley Moore. Shelley's a PhD candidate at UBC, where I work, and an inclusion advocate, and is quite well known for her advocacy work and has been so active over these last 12 months, really keeping this conversation going while COVID has been happening, and we're delighted to have you, Shelley. Shelley, we have a question for you, and we know that you will build. There you are. You just popped onto the screen. We know that you'll build from this question. So pop on your timer there. This question really takes up the challenge of how we've been framing challenging behavior. And so we invite you to talk to us a little bit about how can we support a different approach to behavior than what is typically the reaction that we have.
I only have 5 minutes. Okay, so I was thinking about this, and I mean, this question is so complex because I mean, like, how big do you go? I mean, we could talk, okay, what different approach to behavior? Well, are we going to talk about shifting our mindset about how we view disability? Are we going to talk about shifting like, you know, the ableist infrastructure of education in general? Like, you could go as big or as narrow as you want in answering this question. And so I'm just like, okay, I've got 5 minutes. Let's talk about this from the story level, right? Just like Tracy was saying, you know, and as I'm listening to the story of this family, like what's standing out to me is exactly the takeaway that I would want all of you to have, is that a different approach to challenging behavior is to stop reacting to the individual and making a plan for the individual, and instead saying, wait a second, let's look around the individual, right? Because, you know, the more that I learn and listen and hear from disability advocates and self-advocates, the more that I realize that we've spent so many resources on trying to get kids ready to be included, rather than saying, how do we get these contexts ready for kids? How do we support teachers? How do we support peers? How do we support classrooms? But that puts the onus and the emphasis of change on the system, not the individuals. And, you know, it's so much easier for a classroom to change than it is for an individual to change a fundamental piece of who they are. And so I think the more that I realize about this, and I also reflect on my own experience, like growing up, Leighton was my teacher in middle school, and I absolutely had challenging behavior, and where I felt like I belonged and where I had the least challenging behavior was where I felt that I had connection and relationship and contribution. And that was with people who saw past the challenge and they looked for the person and they looked for the ways that they could connect to me. And all these quotes come to mind, right? Like, you know, every kid has a story to tell. And, you know, my favorite one that I talked about in the video is that, you know, like as educators, we were taught to, you know, if a flower isn't blooming, just pick them out of the garden, as opposed to ask the question, well, why isn't the flower blooming? We have to look at the soil. We have to look at the sunlight. We have to look at the conditions around the flower. Because if one flower isn't blooming, there's going to be other flowers that pop up. And so this is connected to frameworks, universal design for learning. And oh my goodness, like we could open up an individual education plan, can of worms. Like there's so much we can do, but you realize that if we're going to answer this question, like how do we support a different approach to behavior? I think all of us, whether we are a teacher, a parent, an administrator, in the ministry, like all of the levels of education that we are, I think all of us have to really take a minute, and I encourage you all to really do this and really reflect on what are these ableist structures that are existing that are expecting kids to be something that they're not. And, you know, where in these ableist structures is like, do you start to notice the value of compliance instead of identity? And where in these ableist structures is there opportunities for students to get lost in a system that doesn't value difference? And so, I mean, this is bigger than all of us, but then you start to kind of really sit with this. Well, it's so embedded in our system that we don't even realize it's problematic anymore. And then all of a sudden you hear stories like Tracy's family that she shared, and you realize that this is only, oh, that's only one family. But then you start to realize, well, that actually represents so many families, and we feel uncomfortable often because by responding to those families, it means that we have to become uncomfortable, which means we've probably benefited off of the privilege of that ableness that we have and our system has. And so it's uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be uncomfortable, but it's worth it. And we're learning about this. We are learning about this in anti-racism movements. We're learning about this in diversity and identity movements. And it's really, really thinking about, okay, these families matter. These families matter. And it's not just one family, it's thousands of families. And every family that has a story like what Tracy told, it's impacting a whole community that is, and the impacts of that are bigger than any curricular outcome. And I can't communicate that enough. And if you know the work of the panelists that are here today and myself, you know that, once you see it, you can't unsee it. And then you end up fighting for it for the rest of your life, because you can't even imagine an education system that doesn't do what this video is talking about, is seeing the kid, seeing the story, being curious, leaning into the discomfort, because this population that we are designing for, or aiming to design for, has contributions to this educational system that people are missing out on, and everyone deserves to hear those voices. So I'm so proud to be a part of this project. I'm so proud that it includes such diverse voices. I'm honored that I was considered one of them. And I'm just, I'm thrilled at the response that it's getting, because it needs to be seen everywhere. All these stories need to be told. 5 minutes, boom.
Yes, you nailed it. Thank you so much, Shelley. That was wonderful. Good timing. Now I would like to introduce our next panelist, who is Nathan Ming. He is the Director of Instruction for Learning Support Services in the Abbotsford School District and President-elect of BC CASE, which stands for the BC Council of Administrators of Inclusive Support in Education. So we're taking out to you, Nathan, and to get us started, the first question we wanted to ask you is like, how can we change outcomes for students?
Thanks, Erica. Boy, it's tough going after Shelley. She said it all. I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking or participating from the traditional unceded territory of the Samath and Mathaway First Nation. It's just an honor to have been invited to speak on a very important topic and something that's near and dear to my heart. Written a few things down, just following Tracy and Shelley. Really, when we look at changing outcomes for diverse learners, it's really an equity issue. And it's about creating successful opportunities that see and value the individual in attempts to break down some of those systemic barriers. So as Shelley alluded to, it's more than the individual, it's about our collective efforts to tackle the things that are getting in the way of the success of all of our learners within our system. I would say it's important to start from a place of curiosity. So we heard that in the video, that to be curious about the students that we work with, to see the strengths that they bring into a situation. Every student wants to be successful. And for us to see that in them and to hold that up, to bring their voice into the conversation around their learning. If we're truly committed to changing the trajectory for diverse learners, then we have to recognize and value the strengths and what they can contribute to their success. I mean, there's so many wonderful stories out there of when we can get to that place as the adults in those environments, that we can see great success. Here in Abbotsford, we've recently seen students who have, one just recently employed with the school district, given the opportunity to thrive and to use their interests and their strengths to embrace their identity, that they will take advantage of that. And it's about setting the environment. So it's all about the adults and those working with the students to make those changes and to set up that environment around them. It's about positive connections and partnerships. And so I think the video talks to the need for collectively, whether you're a parent, a grandparent, teacher, administrator, ministry representative, for all of us collectively to work in partnership. Some of these are very complex and challenging situations, but all of us have the same goal in mind, which is for every single student to reach their potential, and in partnership we can help break down some of those barriers to help that to happen.
Thank you.
One of the other questions I was asked to address was, what are we still struggling with in learning? These are very complex situations. When we get into situations where there's complex behavior, sometimes we forget that we're working with children, with students, with youth. And I think at the end of the day, we have to take a step back and remember that. And I don't say that in a way that people aren't. Sometimes the emotion and the commitment causes us to not see that. And I think it's important for everyone in that situation to step into that situation with a growth mindset. And so you heard from Tracy's story, sometimes we get ourselves into difficult places from a public education standpoint or from a team standpoint. But in partnership and working with one another, we can, with an understanding that everyone wants to be successful, that everyone wants to be heard, that everyone has strengths, that collectively we can work together and to better understand the individual, to better understand the system, to institute or provide means to support individuals with whatever their goals and dreams are. I think today I was just in the meeting, and at the end of the meeting, where it was a difficult conversation, but the parent said, "I feel heard." And I think at the end of the day, from the perspective of an educator, we want to provide that opportunity for everyone to feel heard, and that we have that ability to take action on that offering from the parent or from the student. And so, again, what's the communication? What are the unmet needs? What are the unseen strengths that if we come from a place of curiosity, we can see and capitalize on, again, to bring collectively everyone to the table, to work together, to support that individual to be successful.
Thanks, Nathan. Right on time. It's almost like each of you heard the person before you and then kind of built and extended and offered us. I appreciate that you talked about how can we change outcomes, but also that there are things that we're struggling with. It's not just you do this and something works, but this is work that we have to do together. Our fourth panelist has arrived. Alex, I can't believe you did it. Good for you. So Alexander Magnuson is joining us. Alex is a self-advocate and an employment specialist at CBI Consultants and was working right until 4 o'clock. And so we had ourselves timed as best as we could. And Alex, we're just so glad that you made it. And
Alex is just having some technical difficulties. He just called me. He just has to restart his computer, but he's there. He's going to be here in a few minutes.
Excellent. Thanks, Leah. I did see that he was here.
He was here, and then he just called me and said, my computer is having some technical difficulties. So
just as we're setting this up, I'd just like to speak to the importance and how valuable it was to have self-advocates participate in the film series and share their stories. There's so much more content that each shared. And if you look in the other films in the series as well, you'll see self-advocates sharing their perspectives. These are adult self-advocates who are reflecting on their school experience and contributing what not just they experienced, but also where could we head and where could we go. And when Alex is able to join us, Alex will speak to that piece. A couple folks in the chat box are just asking, where are these films? Where can we find them? We will have a slide at the end of the session that has the addresses, but Inclusion BC will have them on their website, as will the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship. If you'd like to use these films and download them, there'll also be an address there that you can email to ask for permission, and then you'll get the link to be able to download it. So if you'd like to use it in professional development or in parent evenings or in coursework, wherever that might be, that's what'll happen. Alex, I see that you're back.
I am, yes. Sorry about that. I thought that was everyone, and nope, just me.
Alex, I've got a question for you. I just talked a little bit about the importance of having the self-advocate voice. And so
yeah.
the question I'm going to ask you is, what do we need to remember, or what do we need to think about from the perspective of the self-advocate when we think about this conversation about challenging behavior?
Well, first of all, it's one of those things where it's not challenging behavior because we obviously want everyone else to know that it's challenging behavior in the sense of it is, frustrating for everyone that has to quote unquote deal with that. But it's also, and if not more, 10 times harder for the person themselves having that hard time. And it's not, and it's weird to call it challenging behavior because it's a person having a hard time. It is not a person trying to be difficult or annoying or any of that, because the last thing we want is to be quote unquote difficult. We want to have a good day just like anyone else. So it really affects us to even more than the person having to quote unquote deal with that person. So remember that we're not doing it on purpose. We're doing it because we're having a hard time and we're having a crisis in that moment of whatever that quote unquote challenging behavior is. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. What would have made a difference for you thinking back on your experiences as a student?
I think honestly, what I just said is a lot. I'm a quite capable person, but when I'm having a hard time, of course, I'm having such a hard time. And I think people needed to remember that I'm not trying to give somebody a hard time. I'm actually having a really hard time. And it's really hard for me, I knew that people were annoyed by me, and I knew that people were frustrated by me, and I knew that people thought, oh, would you just stop? And it really was, think about it. Does a kid really want to have a hard time? No, they want to have a good day. They want to impress the people. They want to make the people that they're caring for them happy and excited for them to be around. And it's when, I know when my kid's having a hard time, it breaks my heart, but it also, I want to make sure that my kid isn't feeling like, oh, I'm disappointing Alex. I'm disappointing and it's like, no, you're never disappointing me. You're having a hard time, my boy, and it's all good. So it's I got treated like that, where, it was very much, oh, would you just stop? I would never want my kid to be like, I hope that, I always want my kid to be like, oh, I'm having fun with him and all that. And even when he is having a hard time and having a complete meltdown and kicking the inside of my car and making my car all dirty and all that stuff, I don't want him to ever think that, I'm disappointed in him, because I'm not. And, cars can be cleaned, right? So it's one of those things where I wish that people had my understanding when people were supporting me.
Terrific. Thanks, Alex. Anything else you want to share before we move to the questions, the panel questions?
No, just thank you for bearing with me and with my, I'm glad everyone's around. Thank you.
You somehow made up for the time. We're right back on time, Alex. So I
knew I am the timekeeper. Even if I don't know it, I am the timekeeper.
Certainly you are. Certainly you are. So I think we're going to get ready to go on to the questions. We have heard a lot of very interesting and provocative ideas, and they all connect with each other. So Leighton, is it okay if we start with some of the questions? Our panelists are ready. Some thumbs up. So there's one question. This one speaks a bit to advocacy efforts, and I'm thinking probably Tracy might be in a good fit to share that, just because of the experience we had right before this one, but before this webinar. And it says, can you share with us what has been done to communicate these learnings with the ministry so that parents or caregivers are not always fighting for what a student needs for support, and the school districts are equally educated on what they need to do?
It's such an interesting question. Like you said, we just came like directly from a meeting with the new Minister of Education to this panel presentations. Erica was there, and Angela from Family Sport Institute, and Carla was there as well, who's hiding here somewhere. And so that is one of the things that we do as organizations and that can be done is speaking with the Minister of Education. But the other thing we do is we meet on a regular basis with the Inclusive Education Division of the Ministry of Education. And I feel like, you know, it's been really, really extra regular since the pandemic started. And I think that's been really beneficial. It kind of brings the tone of crisis and reaction down to conversation and trying to, you know, be more forward thinking about stuff. So we talk about things like the future new inclusive education policy manual, which we'd love to see released soon, because the other one is quite out of date at this point. That's just, you know, one example. And then, you know, we all engage with school districts, and parents, you know, can really play a key role there. I think if they can spend more time talking with their school districts, again, in that, it's better if it's in that manner where you're having an ongoing conversation, right? And it's a conversation, not a conflict. So those are just my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Yeah, a lot of important work going on. Leighton, do you want to bring what question? I'm going through the questions and I've also identified some of them. Do you want to choose one? It's exciting to be able to choose from.
I think we've got one. So thanks, Tracy, for talking about how this work is happening to advocate on behalf of parents. And Inclusion BC is central in that work, as is your organization. Kate Neufeld asked, I've sometimes heard challenging behavior rephrased as unexpected behavior. Would this be a better term to use? What do you think, panelists?
From my perspective, Leighton, I wouldn't say it's unexpected behavior. I think from a perspective of looking at the environment, there are a lot of things that are predictable. And so when we talk about behavior as communication, that there's a message that's trying to be communicated, or there's a moment where a need is gone unmet. And so, I mean, I refer to it, you know, there are complex behaviors, looking at the environment, looking at who the individual is. I wouldn't want to ever say that a behavior is unexpected. I think we, as educators, from an educator perspective, there's lots of things that we can learn about a child or a student and can anticipate in the environment to know if a behavior is going to occur. And I prefer to use the term complex. Just because some of these situations, there's lots of different factors involved. But I think for the most part, from my perspective, lots of times the behavior can be anticipated based on the plan that we have set up.
Thanks, Nathan. Alex, I saw you making some motions.
Yeah, sorry. For me, it's one of those things that, like Nathan said, that there's a lead up always. Sometimes the lead up is really, really, really quick, and you're like, whoa, where'd that come from? But if you look before, I was thinking, okay, well, what would I call it? If I had to name a name of something I would call it, and I would say it, expression of communication, or I would say a communicative behavior, because I would put the communication first before behavior, which I haven't off the top of my head figured out a new word for like behavior, because behavior is like, there's good behavior, bad behavior. But anyways, I would say it's communicative behavior, because they're communicating before they just had to do a real like it more quote unquote effectively for people to listen, because there was communication before that behavior. So it's the what happened before that really matters, because the after is just the crisis version. We want to get 1 second before the crisis version, so then the crisis doesn't have to happen. So it's, and believe me, I've worked with many, many people that there's like, it's all of a sudden they went, whoa, right? And it's like, no. What was that 1 second, 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 6 seconds before the behavior happened? And that's where it's like, oh, and then it's like, oh, okay, slight twitch of an eye, or, you know, kind of balled up fists, or whatever, right? What happened before that? And that's the real communication, and that's what's the silent but really important communication needs to happen.
And it's a lot of what I hear from you, Alex, is that a tuning, right, with the student and being able to identify it. And that comes from the relationships that we build.
And that's the relationship, exactly. If you don't have a relationship with the kid or the person that you're supporting, then you're gonna see a lot more of crises happen quickly.
Thank you, Alex. Take it from the person with the life experience who is educating us. Thank you so much, Alex. And I want to bring out that there's a couple of questions that I'm going to do a bit of a merge of them, that they're asking on how to bring this perspective and knowledge of inclusion to an occasional teacher position. One of them is asked, and another one to bring it to change a school culture, how to bring these perspectives when you're probably one of those who are just starting leading the way. I'm thinking maybe Shelley, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, this is a good question. I get it a lot. Oh, hold on, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
This is a very good question, but it's also a very complex question, because I'm kind of reading through the questions myself, and I see, okay, well, how do you, because there's a couple things there. How do you shift a culture? One. Number two is, well, what if parents don't want those kids in your class? Well, that's like, how do you value diversity that includes disability? That's what that means. Another one is, well, how do we shift that whole idea of like, well, resources are needed to use this. Like, a lot of people associate, well, the shift in culture requires belief, the shift in culture requires resources, the shift in culture requires like all of these things. But at the end of the day, there are people in every district who are already doing this work. Do you know what I mean? Like, with the same resources, with the same mindsets. And so I think it's not about reinventing the wheel. I think it's finding the people out there who are already doing this, and they've been doing this for decades. Leighton calls it like the people on the edges who are doing this work in ways like it is. I know someone asked about French immersion. Like, it is not, French immersion is very important in the Canadian context, but if you have a culture that says that one group, this French immersion is only for one group, well, that's a cultural shift, not a resource shift, right? And so I think there's many things here. Every district is supporting students of all abilities. How do we learn from each other? How do we learn from people who are already doing the work? How do we go to places where students do feel supported? There was another question around, well, how do you help parents to get the culture shift, right? And so then Cynthia, that's the other question, is what if there's not buy-in? Well, that's a bigger issue than resources. That's a bigger issue than a cultural shift. That is, you're starting to get into human rights ethics, right? Like, if you don't have the buy-in from your teachers, well, that's a leadership issue around, well, if you don't believe that all students deserve to have access to this, is that really a publicly supported system, right? And when we're in the business of public education, I think it's very, very important that as leaders, we are communicating that all identities belong in classrooms of diversity. The part that's tricky is that for a very long time, disability is an asterisk to identity, and it's not seen as a contribution to a classroom. It's often seen as a burden to a classroom. And so that has nothing to do with resources. That has everything to do with mind shift. And how we're going to shift mindset is by showing people what's possible, by having hard conversations like this, but getting our leaders to believe and to take action and to allocate resources in ways that foster inclusion rather than using resources in ways that actually counteract it. So of course we're going to need resources. Of course we're going to need staffing. Of course. But there are so many resources that are used that are actually preventing a cultural shift because they're being used in ways that actually counteract efforts to move inclusion forward, because leadership and teachers don't believe that these students have a contribution to their diverse classroom. So, I mean, we could talk about this for hours because it's not simple. It's very complex. And so as an individual, I think we all have to sit with ourselves and ask ourselves, do we believe that all students need to be there? Are we using resources in optimal ways? Do we provide opportunities for all students to contribute and not just exist in a classroom learning environment? I can appreciate that not everybody knows how to do that, but that's what we can work with. we can't work with people who don't believe it's possible. And so that's why like that mind shift is critical, whether you are in a French immersion classroom or in like a kindergarten classroom or a high school physics classroom. If we have to really ask ourselves, not only do we believe that this is possible, but do we see it as a value to the conversation around diversity and identity? Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Thanks, Shelley. Erica, I'm going to move to another question, if that's okay, just based on the time that we have. We have wonderful questions in the Q&A box. If you have a question, that's where to pop it, everyone. Robin asks about how can we move forward, or how can education or educators, but it's really about the system, she says, the education system move forward in a way that brings folks in as partners. Are some folks interested in willing to talk about working in partnership to try to move forward when it comes to, I'm not going to say unexpected, I'm not going to say expected behavior. I'm just going to speak about communication we don't understand or things that we can change. But the question that Robin's really asking is about how can we work in partnership? What can we do as a system to work more in partnership with whomever you want to speak about partnership with? And maybe, Tracy, you haven't had a chance to speak for a little while. Would you be willing to start us off?
Sure. I mean, it's, I guess I feel like it's what I do every day, and that's what our organization is, foundationally all about, is working in partnership with lots and lots of other groups. I mean, like say this meeting just prior to this morning, I was on the phone with Terry Mooring from the BCTF. Like, my whole way of being is connecting with as many people as I can to understand all the different perspectives, just even listening, really good listening is so important, I think. And, just listening to what Alex was saying earlier about how to describe and what kind of words to use, it just made me think about how we pathologize behavior in kids who have a diagnosis. But we don't pathologize it in ourselves. But, I keep coming back to, I really think that mind shift might be, let's not talk about behaviors anymore. Let's talk about our reactions, and I think that's a big conversation that needs to be had by many, many different people.
Thanks, Tracy. Nathan, did you want to contribute?
Sure. It's a big question. I think from a system perspective, when we talk about partnership and engagement in conversations, I think it's being willing to walk into some of the, I think it was Shelley earlier had talked about uncomfortable conversations that are necessary, but to do it in a way that calls people in. And so from whichever group you're a part of, recognizing that we're all working towards the same thing. And as we're trying to improve those situations, improve the preparation for diverse classrooms from a teacher education perspective, is how do we call in educators? Again, recognizing that teaching is not an easy task, that the diversity in our classrooms and in the public education system is significant. So how do we call people in to be open to those uncomfortable conversations and to invite, whether it's a parent or another group that's supporting a parent, ministry conversations around improving, the conversations through honest dialogue where there's an examination of kind of our own values and beliefs that we're bringing into the teaching that we're providing to students.
Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you, Nathan. And I think we're getting close to our ending time, but there's one more, maybe we have time for one or maybe two. So the next one, I think this one is really interesting. And thank you, Kate, about when she says that students, sometimes the rhetoric about students with this complex or difficult moments, that they should be excluded because of how they impact other students. So this person is hoping to get some ideas on how to offer some language to respond to those moments in which they are put in these situations and like, oh, this children is actually impacting the rest of the students. They have some ideas, but they want some more language or of words that you could provide. Do you have some suggestions for them? Would anyone like to take that on? Michelle, I see you moving. Go for it.
Take away anyone else's. Okay, friends, here's the thing. Here's the thing. Everyone needs breaks. We all need a break. If there's a student communicating that they need a break, take a break. The problem isn't that students need a break, but that they never come back. Okay, so I think like if in the moment a student is in crisis, I think sometimes just forcing them to stay for the sake of inclusion is not the point here, okay? If a student is having a moment and needs a minute, go for a walk, get some water, just come back, right? And when you say it like that, everybody can have that. Everyone can take a break. This is what you say to parents, everyone sometimes needs a plan B. The problem is when the plan B becomes the plan A and the student is now never there because of challenging behavior. No, we all have moments of challenge. We all have moments of, as Alex says, communicating difficulty, communicating behavior. Take a minute. Take a minute. Go have a list of options for all students to if you need to just get it out, where can we go? Have the students create that. Everyone just needs a minute. So when I'm talking to families about that, I'm like, listen, all of us sometimes need a minute. All of us sometimes need a break. And so we're going to work with the whole class and let everybody know that we're going to take a minute if we need, and these are the things we can do. And this is how we're going to teach that strategy and empower kids to know when they need a minute. Right? This isn't just about moving kids around and sending kids away. This is about, let's talk about strategies for when we feel overwhelmed. Let's talk about some supports that can put in place if I'm just overwhelmed with noise. What are some things I can do, especially if I have a hard time communicating that in the moment? Let's anticipate. Let's take a minute and build this criteria together as a plan of action, as a whole community. And that, my friends, is the core competencies. And that right there is now in the curriculum for all students. And so when parents are concerned about challenging behavior in the classroom, I say, what an incredible opportunity for all of us to learn about how to regulate our emotions and behavior in meaningful ways that promote self-determination.
Thank you, Shelley. And I see you, Alex, nodding. And I want to go back to what you say in the video, Alex. Would you like to add something to that? Because that's exactly what you said, like how when your peers were supportive of you. Would you like to add something to that, Alex?
Yeah, absolutely. My thing is like, this is such like when somebody, like say when I was having a challenging moment, this would be a really great time for a peer to be like, it's okay, I got you. Because we need those kid champions. We need those examples that are really there, they're on the kid's side no matter what. And it's also a really great way to show the other kids that this kid is, having a meltdown and having a really hard time, but it doesn't make the kid any less of an amazing kid. It's just the kid is having a hard time. So if you can teach the other kids that, yes, they have a hard time, but you also have a hard time. How do you show you have a hard time? I know my kid has a hard time all the time, right? I have a hard time. You have a hard time. Everyone on this panel has a hard time. It's how do we get to one, accept it, and how do we get to forgive ourselves and move on? Because I'm telling you, the kids that are just had a hard time and got dragged out of the classroom feels terrible about themselves because they got dragged out of the classroom. Two, and I know that from experience, and two, it would be that, it's okay to have a hard time, and what can we do about that? And I totally agree. If plan B is always the first plan, it's terrible. But when plan B is truly a plan B, then and that's what works. And if there is a safety net for that child and for their peers, it is a lot more effective than just like, if you don't behave, I'm taking you out of this classroom. It's no, if you need a moment, where can you go? What can you do? Here's something A, B, and C, what you could do. And then it's, it gives the kid a lot more power of like, okay, oh, I'm having a hard time. And this was something that I was taught in grade 11 was, if you're having a hard time, you can take a break. Where I went through 10 years of, if you don't settle down, you're out of this classroom, or just get out. But that's my other TEDx talk. But yeah, it's one of those things where teach them in kindergarten that they can they can have a safe space to go in and have a moment or two and have water, or jump up and down, or spin in a chair, or whatever they do. I know that's what I did. So there's it's always they need options, or else they go into crisis mode, and then all of a sudden a chair gets flipped, or right. So it's options before the crisis becomes a crisis. Thank you for coming to my TEDx talk.
Thanks, Alex. As I move to the close, everyone, I know Erica is going to put our closing slide back up on the screen. And so you'll see, I'm not sure how many of our panelists you'll see at this point. We want to begin by thanking our panelists for joining us today and trying to fit their thinking into this interesting format. We, as the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship and Inclusion BC, we want these films to inspire future learning for educators and the community at large, families, self-advocates, organizations, by offering knowledge, strategies, and approaches that debunk negative myths about inclusion of students with disabilities in regular classrooms. We want to raise the expectations for the educational outcomes for all students, and particularly students with developmental disabilities. And our goal is to shift the language from deficit language to strength-based and honoring language that honor and recognize cultural approaches and position students with developmental disabilities as contributing members to classroom communities in our society. We hope that you'll check out the fourth film coming out Friday around indigeneity and disability. And we encourage you to go back and look at the previous films as well and draw them into your sharing with families as educators, as professional development in ways that recognize the good work we're already doing and help us shift things to move forward as well. And I'll pass the torch to Erica.
Thank you, Leighton. This has been a great webinar today. Thank you to all our panelists for your insights. And we want to invite you all to share them, gather with your networks and your communities to watch these films and start those conversations. We know we can get into the uncomfortable situations, but sit together and hold each other to go through this. So share the learning with us and others. So we would love to hear what are you planning to do. And if you would like to get these films for streaming, you can send us an email to info@inclusionbc.org, and we can give them to you the access to download them in for better quality for streaming as you watch with your networks. And we also were going to be asking you for your feedback for the event today. So I just want to mention you're going to receive an email from Eventbrite with a survey. We'd love to hear your feedback. We thank you so much for all the comments that you're putting on the chat box. It's very encouraging for us to see. This is like a culmination. But as we're finishing this project, really the work is just beginning to spread the word, to inspire some new action. And we look forward to hearing about all these actions that you're planning to take after this if videos have inspired you. And we thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. And Leighton, this has been very fun. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and have a great evening, folks. And thank you to all of our film participants.